few weeks ago, I did a small e-commerce project and I got caught by the sandbox trap. I used an enterprise feature during development and switching to the smallest plan was not possible anymore. Paying the enterprise rate was also not an option, so I needed something else. I found Vendure and got in contact with Michael. His support is world class. Now enjoy his talk.
Hi, my name is Michael, and today I want to talk to you about my project Vendure, which is an open source framework for developing e-commerce applications. Now, why, you might be thinking, should I be interested in e-commerce development? Well, as you might have noticed over the past year or so, due to COVID, there's been quite an increase in activity with e-commerce. And as a result, there's been a big increase in demand for applications to serve this need. So there's a lot of developers finding themselves having to develop e-commerce applications. And if you happen to fall into this category now or in the future, then my hope for you is that you have an enjoyable and productive time of it. And that's my motivation behind this project. But before we get into it all, we need to back up a little bit, and I need to give you a little bit of context about how I came to start this project. So when I was a kid, my parents started in a shop selling art materials, paints, brushes, paper, and so on. At the time, I was pretty good with Netscape Composer, so my dad asked me to build a website for the shop, and of course I gladly agreed. So, it was static HTML, years ahead of its time, and the best part was the order form was just a form that the customer would fill out. It would then email it directly to our inbox, complete with the payment details. Those were simpler times, what can I say? Anyway, a few years later, we needed a better solution, so I bought this book, which had a whole chapter on building an e-commerce application. It was perfect. It was meant to be. As a fun fact, 15 years later, our core files for our shop still use the same naming conventions given in this example. Anyway, fast forward to 2017, and we've finally reached the limits of my haphazard solution. We needed something new. By this time, I've got a lot more developer experience under my belt. I've been working for the past few years on the team of an open source CMS, and I was really into TypeScript and the NPM ecosystem as a whole. So for our new website, I made a survey of the current e-commerce development landscape to help us decide what we should build our next iteration upon. So of course, the first major choice is between software as a service, SaaS, or self-hosted. So some of the well-known SaaS services for e-commerce include Shopify, BigCommerce, and Commerce Tools. And for many businesses, going with the SaaS route makes a lot of sense, but not always. Factors such as pricing models, the features, and the ease of extension mean that sometimes a dedicated framework for custom development does make more sense. So since the early 2000s, when I had started working on my PHP website, there had been a proliferation of open source e-commerce frameworks. There's lots and lots and lots that I was trying to evaluate at the time. Here's a selection of some of those that I researched at the time. And there's a few interesting points about this chart. Firstly, by this time in 2017, many of these solutions were actually quite old, around a decade or so, give or take. Now, being old in itself is not a bad thing at all. Being old implies feature completeness, battle-tested, robust. But at the same time, it can also imply an outdated tech stack and maybe a not ideal developer experience, right? The second point is, if we look at the underlying technologies for these frameworks, there's a trend going on right here, right? Now, I don't hate PHP at all, but if I could choose, I'd rather use something like TypeScript. Reaction Commerce was at the time the only major e-commerce framework that's targeting JavaScript. And for me, it was a real shock to see that this huge community of JavaScript developers was completely underserved. And the third thing that's interesting is that all of these solutions at that time are monolithic, by which I mean the storefront and the server itself are coupled. So when a customer comes to the website and wants to view a product page, that request goes to the server gets the data from the database, puts it inside a template, and serves the completed view back to the customer. So of course this is not really surprising, because at the time that's the status quo. This is how you built dynamic websites. But what's interesting is that I had spent the previous 3 years working on a headless CMS, an open source CMS, and I'd really kind of come to appreciate this headless architecture. Now in 2017, headless was still kind of niche, and specifically the idea of headless e-commerce had not yet reached the full-blown buzzword status that it enjoys today. So this is the context around how I started building my own solution. My aim was to create a truly modern headless e-commerce framework built on technologies that I personally enjoyed using and find really productive. And at the same time, these technologies also represent this huge underserved community of developers around the world, namely Node.js, TypeScript, and GraphQL. And if we think about it, if you're building a web application, you need to use JavaScript, for the front end at least. And these days, the chances are that you'll be actually using TypeScript. So let's make it now possible for developers to create full stack TypeScript e-commerce applications. Enter Vendure. So I've been working on Vendure for about 3 years now, and just last month we released version 1.0. It's in production in projects large and small, but I'm not going to go too much into the marketing side in this talk. If you're interested in case studies and feature lists and that kind of thing, check out the website, vendure.io. For now, I want to concentrate on the developer experience. So to get started with a new Vendure project, you would use npx vendure create. This is going to guide you through the scaffolding and configuration of a brand new project. You tell it what kind of database backend you want, the credentials, and so on, as you can see here. Now, Vendure itself will run on a number of different database backends, and resource-wise, it's not very demanding. For example, we run our demo instance on a $5 a month DigitalOcean box with SQLite, so it's definitely going to run on your machine. Now this process is going to also populate the instance with some test data, so you can be up and running straight away and try things out yourself. The installation takes a few minutes, so let's fast forward until all that's done. Alright, so now we've got a full e-commerce server up and running. Let's check it out. So we're inside the directory it just created, my shop, and we'll run yarn start. This is going to start up the server and the background worker. Now the server's up and running. Let's take a look first of all at the admin interface. So let's log in with the credentials that we supplied at the start. Alright, here's the dashboard, and let's just take a look at a few of these screens. So we've got a list of products, which we can edit and view the variants. We have collections, and we can organize our stuff. We don't have any orders yet, but we do have a bunch of assets. Okay, let's see what else we can play with. Alright, so in development mode, we also bundle the GraphQL Playground. So this lets us just run some arbitrary GraphQL queries. So we can see that the server's responding as we expect there. We can change parameters here. There we go, so that's all working nicely. Alright, we'll just stop that. And now let's look into the project itself. Let's see what we've got in there. So, as we can see, we've got node modules, of course, and a bunch of the usual config files in the root. And really, the project itself consists of just 3 files. Index is how we start the server. index worker starts the background worker process, and really everything interesting happens here inside the Vendure config file. So one of the design decisions that I made while creating Vendure is that I wanted all configuration to be really localized, so that if you have to change something, you know exactly where it's supposed to go and where to look to see what's going to be changed. In doing research on various other frameworks, I've had the experience that sometimes pretty simple changes mean that you have to jump through a bunch of different files in different parts of the code base just to do, like, I don't know, add like one property to a model or something. And sometimes you end up having to configure various like YAML and XML config files. So that's something that I wanted to avoid with Vendure, and I tried to make everything, all the configuration is code, it's all TypeScript, and it all lives in one place. So I'm going to give you an example of how easy it is to configure something. So let's take, for example, we want to add a custom field to a model, which is something really common. In our case, we're going to add a weight field to the product entity, so we can store product weights. So what we would do is come down here to our custom fields configuration, and we say we want to add it to product, and we want the name to be weight, and we want the type to be, let's say, an integer, and let's say we want to set a default value, which would be 0. Now the cool thing about TypeScript is that we get type safety, so if the default value is given as a string, it's an error. So that's one nice thing about having the config as code rather than a format like YAML, for example. Okay, so that's all it takes really. So let's go back and we'll kick off the server again. And what this is going to do, that one line change, is going to do a few things actually. It's going to update the schema in the database, adding a new column for storing the weights. It's going to update the GraphQL APIs so that when we update or create or query a product, we now have this new field. It's also going to update the admin UI so that we can actually enter the data for the weight into the UI when we're editing a product. And I'll show you that now. So let's go back over to our admin UI, log back in. So now if we look at a product, we now see that we have the custom field weight here, and then we can set a weight and save it. And now if we look over at the GraphQL playground, so we should be able to ask for custom fields, and we should be able to ask for the weight. Okay, and we can see right here that we get the weight of our laptop as 8, which is, I think, what we put in here. So that's all working. So there we go. So a simple customization, which is very common. I tried to make it really as simple as possible, type safe and intuitive for the developer. So when you're developing a real application, the customizations are not always that straightforward quite. So let's take another example, which is now slightly more complicated. Let's say we want to make it so that customers can upload an avatar image for their profile. Now this involves something like creating a new image, which we call an asset in Vendure, making some kind of relation with the customer, setting up so that you can update the image from the mutation which is updating the customer, update the GraphQL APIs to embed this image type inside the customer custom field, and updating the admin UI so that we have like an image upload and selection widget to go in the customer detail view. Okay, so quite a lot of things going on here. So let's see how this would look if we want to set this up with Vendure. We'll go back into the config again, and so now we're going to set it up for customer, a new custom field. We'll give it a name, avatar. And now this time for the type, we're going to have a type called relation. And the entity is going to be of type asset, which we'll import now. It should have done that automatically. Good. Okay, actually, that's all you need. Let's restart the server and then take a look. Alright, so let's go over to our customers. Now we don't have any, so we're going to create a new one. Okay, and as you can see, we actually have this custom field now, an avatar, where we can select an asset. Let's upload one, and that's handy. Let's choose that one and create. So these examples illustrate the overall design philosophy with Vendure in regards to developer experience, which is make things simple, productive, type safe as much as we possibly can. Now we've got a working GraphQL server, we've got an admin dashboard. There's one thing missing. How do our customers buy our stuff? Of course, that is the storefront, and that is the one thing that we don't ship, and we don't handle that at all. Now there's a few reasons that we don't do anything with the storefront. Number one, I am just one person and I have limited time, so I've had to make the decision to not specialize on doing a storefront as well. It would just be too much work. Secondly, each team will tend to have their own preferred competency, their own stack, their own framework that they know and love and they want to use, and it's quite varied. And thirdly, one of the benefits of headless e-commerce is that you can craft these really custom, unique shopping experiences. And these don't really lend themselves so readily to some kind of out-of-the-box component kit or pre-built storefront. Having said this, there is immense value in lowering the barrier to getting into headless, because having to build a whole storefront from scratch is quite an undertaking. So to that end, I've been working with Vercel and Vue Storefront, who respectively have some really nice solutions for pre-built storefronts in Next.js and Vue. And we've been working on official integrations for Vendure. The Vue Storefront integration is still under development. It's being run by some community members. It's not quite there yet, but the Next.js integration just landed actually a few weeks ago, and I'm going to show that to you now, and we're going to get a storefront up and running to go with our backend server. We'll start off by cloning the Vercel commerce repo and pull that down locally. Once it's been cloned, we'll move into that directory and run yarn to install the dependencies. Now I'm going to fast forward this bit because some of you already stare at screens like this too much in your day job. You don't want to see that in a conference talk. Alright, dependencies are installed. Let's take a look inside that project. So this is a fairly standard Next.js project, but we also have this framework folder which contains the different integrations that are already available. Here we see inside the Vendure folder there is an environment variables template file. Let's copy that and place the copy in the root, and let's rename it to just be .env. One other thing we have to do is point it to our local server that's running. Okay, now we should be able to run yarn next dev, and we'll set the ports to 8000 so we don't get a conflict on port 3000, and start that up. So next is telling us the website is available on localhost port 8000, so let's click through onto that. Okay, and here we have our storefront, and we see the items being populated from our Vendure server. Let's buy something. That mouse looks kind of nice. Okay, let's add that one to the cart. That looks good. So we have it there in our cart. And now let's just verify that it's all actually hooked up as we expect. If we go over back to our admin dashboard and look in orders, active, we can see right here that our mouse is right there in an order. Let's just double check that. Let's change the quantity to 2, refresh, And there we go. So there we have a fully functioning e-commerce backend, admin interface, and storefront in 20 minutes, which is not bad at all. There's a whole bunch of stuff that I've not even touched on, like the killer combination of GraphQL and TypeScript and the end-to-end type safety that brings, the ease of integration with external tools like headless tools like Storyblock, and there's a whole ecosystem of headless parts that can be composed together nowadays. The buzzword is composable commerce. Google it. So thank you very much for watching. If you want to find out more, head to vendure.io, and thank you for your attention today.